Well, thank you, Michel, for your very kind words, and thank you, Hiromasa and Michel, for your very kind invitation. I enjoy this meeting tremendously. I mean, first time in this community, but I have to say, I feel home. So, this is all we know about the brain, okay? And the point here is that we know, we know a lot about, problem is there a pointer? Oh, maybe I use this one. Or do you have a laser pointer or something? No? Ah, thank you, yeah. So we know a lot about microscopic world, especially from animal studies. We know a lot about how the brain is organized on a microscopic scale, and this is common day practice with MRI in humans. And in between, we have the mesoscale, which is the organization of the brain tissue at the scale of a few thousand neurons. And, oops, something which doesn't work. Maybe I switch it. Okay, so I hope it works. Yeah. And to address this scale, we just built the first 11.7 Tesla MRI scanner in the world. And these are images obtained at a resolution of less than 2 micrometers in just 5 minutes. I'm sorry, 0.2 millimeters, 200 micrometers. And you see that we can now see some incredible details in the cortex. But that's not the point of my talk today. My point will be that we know a lot, but still we cannot explain really well mental disorders and consciousness. This is Freud. And Einstein didn't like so much Freud. He didn't endorse Freud for the Nobel Prize. He said in 1928, about the truth content of Freud's teaching, I cannot come to a conviction for myself, which is a little bit strong. And then in 1939, I quite especially admire your achievements, as I do with all your writings from a literary point of view. That says it all. But what Einstein didn't know is that his work might be useful to understand mental disorders and consciousness, as I will show you. This is something coming from the movie City Lights. I'll talk about it more later in my talk. Just as you know well, Einstein and Charlie Chaplin were good friends, and at the premiere of City Light, Einstein said to Charlie Chaplin, you know, you are such a great man, the world admires you, also you don't say a word, and everybody can understand you. And Einstein responded to, Charlie Chaplin responded to Einstein, but you are even better person, because the anti-words admires you, also nobody understands any word of what you say. So you see, it was, everything was there. So, and he said, Charlie Chaplin said, during the final scene, I noticed Einstein sweeping his eyes, and further evidence that scientists are incurable sentimentalists. So it says, gives a framework of what I want to talk today. So first, what can we see with human MRI? And as you know, the main topics we are discussing here is brain at work with fMRI from Seiji Ogawa, and brain diffusion MRI and DTI for the connections. Very briefly, so but Michel said about it. So diffusion MRI is directly issued from this paper by Einstein. It was, in fact, his PhD thesis. The paper published in May 1905 is the most cited of Einstein's paper, more than the relativity theory. And this is taken directly from his thesis. I set up the diffusion MRI framework in 1985. And it was discovered that diffusion in white matter was anisotropic, and these are the very first color images of the white matter showing the orientation that Hiromasa showed before. So 1991, before DTI, and this is after that, I was at NIH that I met Peter Basser, and we developed the full framework for diffusion tensor imaging. And recently there was a paper published in Radiology, and I was a little bit shocked to see that my very first two papers from 1986 and 1988 are the most cited papers in radiology about neuroradiology published since origin of radiology. And this one then in 1990, based on this diffusion imaging method by Mike Mosley, was to demonstrate the existence of anisotropy in white matter. It was not known at that time. It was a discovery, I mean, by this group. And then with Peter Basser and our postdoc, James Mattiello, that's sitting here, we published these two DTI papers, and that's all. So you see, it took many years, but I think now we have some kind of a big picture about what is called the connectome. The connectome came from DTI, but more or less, is how the brain is organized. And the point I'd like to make is that there are many regions around the brain, so in the cortex, which we call gray matter, okay? And my point is that the gray matter might be seen as nodes in a network, and there is a spatial segregation. So regions dedicated to vision, to motricity, and so on. And one task is to understand the organization of the cells, of the neurons and the glial cells, which might be responsible for function. Exactly like for DNA, the genetic code is present in the three-dimensional organization of the molecule. So the idea is that each region is responsible for a particular function. How many do we have? I don't know, maybe about 300, but we cannot do everything. If you look at the QR code, there's no way you can read it. Even if you spend 10,000 hours trying to understand a QR code, you cannot do it. Also, it is a human brain invention. So what else? If you give a smartphone to kids, very quickly they can use them. Hopefully there is no gene of smartphones yet, no circuit for smartphones. So what do the kids do is that they put together some of the networks nodes here, so they connect them. And this is why I think white matter has been overlooked. It has been discussed previously. White matter is a very important component of the brain. The white matter volume during evolution grows more than the gray matter volume. So we are here. You see that whales, dolphins have even more white matter than we do. And you know, of course, that the white matter is about the connections, which are increasing by a terrible number from birth to the end of teenaging. So with DTI, we have the connections. With fMRI, we have the activity. And of course, the goal is to see what's the traffic on those connections. And this is why I have to introduce this brain connectome spacetime. So we are back to Einstein, 1905. And what I have proposed now is to model the propagation of action potentials in the brain network as a pseudo-diffusion process, okay? And don't look about these equations here, but if you want, I can also questions later, but that's not the point. The point is that if we have to do that, we have to understand the effect of time. This is a typical fMRI data set, for instance, in the pleasure center areas. I could take any example. And very often people say, well, this area A, this area B, this area C, they are activated. And this is what we see at the present. But that's not exactly what's going on in the brain. If two areas are seen by us as activated at the same time, those two areas are completely ignorant that they are activated at the same time. Because the action potentials propagate at a finite speed. And you know that this speed depends on the degree of myelination. So long fibers are highly myelinated, and they have a velocity which up to 100 meters per second, while unmyelinated axons have a very small velocity. So there is a limit in the velocity of action potentials. So we are now in the same condition as if you look at the sky at night, you see many stars, like here, But we know for the sky that, in fact, different stars have sent us signals, light, at very different times, billions, tens of billions of years. And this is how we should look at the brain. So then we have to switch to the special relativity theory from Einstein, which was published 1 month later. Because of this limit of the speed of light in the universe, we have to consider that we don't have a three-dimensional space plus time. We have to include time in space, which is the four-dimensional space-time. So it is exactly the same for the brain. But there is a big problem that if I use the relativity theory and the diffusion theory, they were published 1 month apart, the two articles, in fact, I discovered just that they are not compatible. Because in the diffusion paper, velocity can go from -infinity to +infinity. So it's not limited. Very few people have noticed this problem. There are few theses in physics, but it is solvable. So this is a paper I published in 2000. So how to deal with relativistic diffusion. And the point is, don't want to go to the detail, we have to consider the brain four-dimensional space-time in a framework which is not the one we are used to. It's like what we call the Minkowski space-time, which was published in 1908. So Minkowski was the mathematical teacher of Einstein, and he said of Einstein that I would not believe that Einstein could have published something like that, but anyway. So that means these two areas here, they cannot connect because that would imply an infinite velocity. So two regions of the brain are connected only in the past of the present. So this area here, for instance, receives some signals from another region and will send signals to another region, but only within the window of time allowed by the velocity of the propagation. So this trajectory in red, for instance, will not be possible. So this will have huge implications. I'll give you a first example, which is schizophrenia. So schizophrenia is, I talk about the phenotype, what people feel, and one typical example is that schizophrenic patients hear voices. And with fMRI, we can see that indeed they hear voices like normal subjects. So what a difference. But when we hear voices, for instance, when you read a book, you hear yourself, we know we're talking to ourselves. The problem with schizophrenic patients is that the white matter tracks, many of the tracks are abnormal. So the conduction speed will be lower than expected. So this is what I showed before in a normal track, how the information propagates. Now, because of this limited speed, the cones are a little bit smaller, and you see that that will limit the way the propagation can happen in the connectome. So this trajectory, which is correct in the normal tracks, will not be correct in the diseased tracks. The problem is that they have both normal and diseased tracks present in the brain. So if we go to the Minkowski diagram, and so this is an example of some fibers which are wrong, it's not easy to understand. I'll do my best. So let's say it's very, very simple, very, very crude. Let's say that I'm thinking about something more or less unconsciously in a frontal cortex. It goes to the auditory cortex, where it is basically like producing some inner voice, which is recognized, let's say, by the Wernicke area, could be anything, and goes back to the frontal lobe. So you see the time it starts from the frontal cortex and goes to the auditory cortex, I mean, it goes this way. So yes, that's normal. And with the normal conducting fibers, you see that we now have to think in terms of the time frame of the action potentials, not the time frame of the neuroscientist looking at the images. So you see that E2 is still after E1, the difference is smaller. Now, if I take a wrong track and compare to the wrong track, the speed is higher than the limit that can be handled by the tracks. So what goes on looks like faster than the speed of light. It's not the speed of light, it's the speed limit of the connectome. And you see in this case that the time of E2 is coming before the time of E1. That means that the auditory activation will precede the frontal activation, something which is not possible in the universe because the universe is healthy. So this is what's happening. So those people, they hear voices, but they have no way to say that these voices are coming from their own mind. So you have probably felt this impression of déjà vu, which is also something like that. So the clock's asynchrony, because of the faulty connections, result in inner voices to be basically understood as external voices. So I call schizophrenia a disease of the brain's space-time, so a disconnection within our own world. Now, we have to move to a higher level, which is looking at the general relativity theory, because once you enter the field, you cannot stop. So you know very well those kind of ambiguous figures where you can see either a vase or two faces, okay? A more modern view is this, okay, where you can see two configurations, but you cannot see both at the same time. In order to switch from one to the other one, it takes time. And by the way, I don't know if you are aware, but Picasso in France, in Paris, in 19-something, had a girlfriend who was also a friend of a group of physicists. And Picasso had heard about these relativity ideas. And this is how he represented for the first time a lady, face and profile, to squeeze the time. So that's what he called a simultaneous, so it's a collapsing of time in an image. And this was Cubism. Cubism was born from this. It is incredible. And this is a more modern photo. You can see profile or face. The question is, how do we decide what we see and when? So this is a work that we have published years ago, where we show this figure to volunteers, and we have to ask them immediately, what do you see? You click left or right, face or vase. And what we see is that if we look at the fusiform face area, at time 0, the time where the image is projected, if there was some spontaneous activity in this area, unconscious, then the volunteers immediately will say, I see a face. If this area was not activated, blue curve, then they see a vase. So they didn't decide. Okay, so the question is free will. Do we have free will? But that's what it is. So now the question is, after some time, you can say, if you want to see the face or the vase, you can do it. You can decide. But again, going back to this relativistic framework, how could I do that? How can I switch the path going through the FFA or not through the FFA? To do that, you have to curve the space-time. So we have to go away from the flat, unconscious space-time to something conscious. And for that, we have to use the relativity theory, the general relativity theory, which is explaining that how the space-time is curved by gravity. And for instance, when Newton had the apple falling on his head, in fact, it's not the Earth which is attracting the apple. It's just that the curvature of space next to the Earth, which is making that. So I don't know if it will work. Just to show you that this is what is a curvature of space-time. It's not a curvature of space. So it is a space-time which is curved. So if you go to this hotel in Germany, where the carpet is like that, and you go after dinner, after some wine, you have to find your room at the end, I bet you will walk like that, okay? So that's what I call a geodesic, okay? So in the brain, it's exactly the same. And when you take a flight, it doesn't go along what you think would be the straight line. It goes to a complex pathway to take into account the curvature of the Earth, but also geopolitics. For instance, to come from Paris to Japan takes 13 hours because we cannot fly anymore over Russia. So that's exactly the story for the brain. So what I say is that consciousness is exactly the same as a gravitational field. So each node of the brain is active, and depending on the level of activity, action potentials will converge or diverge from those nodes, curving this, the space-time. And the pathways that the action potential will follow within the connectome, because of the nodal activity, have to obey geodesics. So the shortest pathways in space-time, not in space, time is included. So when you see this ambiguous image, you have a choice to have this pathway or this pathway, but in order to going through the FFA or not, I mean, this is something you have to do consciously. So to paraphrase something which is very well known in cosmology, so the brain space-time tells activity how to flow, while the activity tells brain space-time how to curve. So let's see some examples of that. Well, first, this is a simulation I've done with Einstein's equation. So this is basically in 2 dimensions only the brain cortex. And when we get conscious ID, we have this curvature which appears. But you will see that in order to get this diagram, we have to go to 5 dimensions. 4 is not enough. So let me give you an example for the psychotic access to consciousness. This is very old paper that we've shown. If you are shown letters in a subliminal way, so too short, the stimuli enters the brain, but you are not aware that you have seen words, for instance. You need more time to be conscious of the existence of words. So the experiment has been reproduced with numbers now, but in patients with psychiatric disorders, bipolar patients, and schizophrenic patients. So they are shown a number, like 7, then there is a mask, and then after some time, and they have to say if they have seen the number in which one. If the time is too short between the 7 and the mask, then people are not aware that they've seen a number. But what is very interesting is that in those patients with DTI, we know that there are some fiber tracks which are not normal. And measuring the FA along the tracks, we could see that depending, so for the schizophrenic and the bipolar patient with psychotic symptoms, the time to consciousness is longer. It takes more time to be able to see something consciously. But FA is linked to the conduction speed. When FA is large, that means there is more myelin. When FA is small, less myelin. So the conduction speed has a role here for access to consciousness. I will show you this on the next slide, so we skip it for the moment. So the idea is that when we see something in a subliminal way, the curvature is not there. We are not conscious of what we see. When we have enough time to curve our space-time, then we become conscious that there is something that we are looking at. So in the green, this is for normal subject, and in those psychotic patients, you see that it takes more time to curve the space-time. So again, this is what I call a disorder of space-time. Let's go now to depression. Depressed people have often the feeling to be down, low, slow. And in fact, this is also supported by this idea. You know that gravity slows time. So to use the GPS, satellites are 20,000 kilometers away. The time for the GPS satellite goes faster than from us on Earth. So we have to correct for that. Otherwise, the mistake by day would be about 14 kilometers. So we have to correct for this effect. So in the brain of schizophrenic patients, this is probably what's happening. It has been shown that in depressed people, they use a lot the silence network and the default mode networks. So there are more connections occurring with those networks. But those connections are known to be shorter connections, so less balinated, which means that with a smaller speed. So in other words, that means that this hyperactivity in those networks during depression implies that so more short-range connections are used, and also that the connections are slower. So basically, those people really feel the time is going slower, It's not an illusion. It's really what's going on in their own brain. So that thing is quite important to see that, in fact, we can explain some symptoms of psychiatric disorders by this relativistic connectome image. So now I go to something maybe a little more complicated about physics, but don't worry, the organizers have scheduled a coffee break after my talk so that you can recover, right? Okay, so you know black holes, and black hole is that when you have such a high density of mass, the signal cannot, the light can enter but not go out. This is why it is called a black hole. But what you may not know is this very important finding that when you say that light cannot go out, okay, I have secrets, I have books, I have hard drives, I put everything in a black hole, and it will disappear. The problem is that how much information can you put in a black hole? That's a question. I will give you the response, but first, something which is related to information is what we call the entropy, and Hawking and Bekenstein worked out what is called the formula for the entropy of black holes. In fact, the region where, for light, it is a question of it can go out or not is called the event horizon. I love this equation. You have Pythagoras, Boltzmann, Maxwell, Einstein, Planck, and Newton, all in a simple equation. But the point is that it has been shown that the maximal quantity of information that you can put in a black hole is not proportional to the volume of the black hole. If you consider the black hole as a bag, you say, well, it's the volume of the bag. No, it's a surface of the open aperture of the bag, if I can simplify. This is a very important finding, that the information is proportional to the opening, to the surface of the black hole. And it was generalized by Van 't Hoff, who got a Nobel Prize in 1999. It's called the holographic principle. In fact, the three-dimensional world that we see, in fact, may just be a hologram, an image of a reality which is encoded at a 2D surface. And you will see that this has a very important implication for the brain. So basically, this is a 3D hologram of the brain, but all the information to this image of the brain is in the 2D flat image. You have, I'm sure, experienced holograms. And the point, what is so important, you know probably that the quantum mechanics in 4 dimensions and the general relativity of Einstein are not compatible. We are not able to put the microscopic world and the cosmologic world together. So this man, Malesana, worked out something which is extremely elegant, showing that, in fact, if we are considering we are in a 5-dimensional universe, where Einstein's equation for gravity exists, the 4-dimensional space-time representing quantum mechanics is a hologram at the surface. This is considered as the most important breakthrough of the last 30 years. So let me show you how it works in the brain. First, very simple, we don't see the 3D, we don't see in 3D. This is a famous movie, the first movie ever shown in La Ciotat, near Marseille, in France. And the people in the room, when they saw this, everybody left because they were believing that a real train was coming to the room, okay? That's it is. And you know that in the brain, we don't see in 3D. We see flat images in 2D, and it's only in the cortex that the 3D image is built. It is a construction of the brain. There's no 3D image coming to the brain. It is the same also for if you touch somebody, and again, this is the final scene of a City of Light. This lady was blind, and Charlie Chaplin so paid for surgery. She recovers light, and later she recognizes the man by touching the skin. But this also took time. So you see, even for touch, we don't have 3D. So the first level of the holographic principle is that, in fact, the brain constructs what we call 3D. And in physics, in fact, sometimes it is said that physics is a description of the world as we perceive it. So the question is, do we live in a 3D world plus time or not? So according to this is all what we believe to be 3D is in fact constructed by the brain. But it goes further. This is maybe the most provocative slide. Again, I take this from black holes. So the question is that, is it the same in the brain that in fact the surface of the cortex is responsible for all the information we have in the brain? So this is a plot of the cortical surface compared to the volume of the brain across species. And again, you see that it is what we expect. The volume of the surface proportional to the volume, but it is not. The more evolution goes, the more we deviate. So the surface of the cortex becomes more important. It is possible to make black holes by compressing matter a lot. So maybe we can compress a brain so that it becomes a black hole. Is there a volunteer in the room? Michel? You don't want your brain to be a black hole. Okay. I suggest you don't, because it will evaporate. That's what Hawking showed. But anyway, let's say we have done it. I take the physics. I know the mass of the brain, 1.3 kilos. I use the Beschkenstein-Hawking equation, and I find the surface, and I can estimate 7 10 to the power 16 a bit of information. That's the highest content of the brain cortex. Now I take my hat of neuroscientist. I take the synapse density. I assume each synapse is coding for 1 or 0, and I know the cortical surface. So you see, the quantity of information is about the same. It could be a coincidence. But the point is that I believe that this is what is happening in the brain. So we have a 4D space-time on the cortex, which is not conscious. Consciousness appears from the connections of those areas to the white matter, exactly as in the universe, gravity appears from the four-dimensional quantum world. I published this paper last December, and there are more than 5,000 hits so far, so I think it's getting interest. So this is the equation that you find in the paper. So this is the activity of the cortex, which is totally unconscious. And when you connect all those regions, you have to use the 5th dimension, which is curving this space-time, and this is how consciousness appears. So the mind-body problem, so this means that the 5-dimensional connectome space-time allows the natural immaterial, so what we call mind, so it's illusory, on emergence of consciousness as a dual holographic form of the 4-dimensional space-time embedded in our material body real public cortex. So that's what this model suggests. I don't want to say I'm correct, because this has to be demonstrated, but I'll show you immediately how it can be used. This is a work which is well known of a lady, 26 years old, after a car accident. She's in vegetative state, and these colleagues put her in fMRI magnet and ask, like, could you tell us who you are? No, of course, nothing visible, but the lady is answering. On the fMRI system, we see that the language areas, Broca and so on, are activated. Could you think that you are navigating in your home, you are working in your home? Of course, nothing happens, but you see that there are regions which are activated. So, in fact, what has been shown is that in different work, in the vegetative state, the connections are long distance, so fast connections and poor connections. While in active, normal, awake state, there are many connections which are short distance. So this is, again, my relativistic model. And so, in other words, the space-time in the vegetative state is flat, and in a normal state, it is curved. And one way to quantify that is a work which was published by some colleagues. Again, I mentioned the entropy, but the entropy and the diffusion are related. They measured this entropy from DTI and resting state fMRI. So there are equations in the paper, and in different stages of sleep. And you see that there is a clear correlation between the level of sleepiness and this number. So the obvious question is, could we have people going out of a vegetative state by curving the space-time? So that's what I have done in an animal model. This is a rat, okay? The rat is under anesthesia, and we will stimulate a very specific part of the central medius of the nucleus of the thalamus. And you see that the rat will wake up immediately, which I assume means that he is getting access to consciousness. He's still under anesthesia, okay? And with diffusion, we showed that, in fact, the connections are established between this nucleus and the sensory system, the cingulate cortex. So the connections are established, so basically we are curving the space-time. And you know, of course, that it is possible to do fMRI, not from ball, but from diffusion. And the mechanism is that all these dendrites are dynamically swelling and shrinking, and we can modulate this effect by playing on the level of dilation or not of the dendrites. So the next step was to validate that in primates. This was done at Neurospin. So here the consciousness was assessed in the monkeys, so same experiment. And clearly the monkeys get awake and conscious. And the dream, of course, is to repeat this in real patients. So not using electrodes, but using focused ultrasounds to stimulate some specific part of the brain. So because I'm beyond my time, I'll stop here. Thank you very much.